all know strategic thinking is important. After all, we spend so much time doing things, it makes sense that we want to be doing the right things. But in one study, 96% of leaders said they didn't have time for strategic thinking. Obviously, that is a pretty big disconnect. And a big opportunity for you. I'm Dory Clark, author of The Long Game, Reinventing You and Stand Out. In this course, we're going to talk about how to make strategic thinking a habit so that you can tap into the power of high-level insight on an ongoing basis. Join me and learn strategies that will help you become a more insightful and, yes, a more strategic thinker in all areas of your life. Here's a question I like to ask myself. What can I do today that will make tomorrow easier and better? At its heart, that's the essence of strategic thinking. This is different from what we do so often, which is rush around and ask, how can I get everything done today that I need to? Instead, strategic thinking is about lifting our heads up, looking at the situation from a wider perspective, and asking how we can create the future circumstances we want. With strategic thinking, you hold two realities in your mind at the same time. Your future long-term vision and the steps you want and need to take today in order to get there. You can use strategic thinking to help clarify where you want to go in your life or career, or ways to ensure your team or your company is successful. Here are a few classic strategic thinking techniques that are favorites of mine. First, there's strategic planning, where you take your strategic vision and then work backwards from it to very methodically figure out how to accomplish it. You might ask yourself questions like, what steps do I need to take to achieve my goals? And what resources do I need to gather to be successful? Or who do I need to build relationships with in order to build support for my idea? With strategic planning, you break down complex goals into smaller, achievable steps and create a roadmap to help you get there. A second framework you can deploy is scenario planning, where you consider different possible futures and develop plans to address them. You ask yourself, what if X happened, or what if Y happened, and then identify the consequences if it did, and how you could prepare for or mitigate them. Maybe in one scenario, a competitor releases a breakthrough new technology, and you have to adapt to that fast. Or in another, there's a global recession and demand slows. Maybe in a third, there's a regulatory change that affects your industry. When you imagine scenarios and create a plan to address them, it helps you think better and prepare better, no matter what actually ends up happening. Third, you can try doing a SWOT analysis, which stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Taking the time to systematically walk through it and answer questions. What are the threats I should be prepared for in my industry, and are there hidden opportunities I'm overlooking? Can be really informative and help you discover insights you've been overlooking. Strategic thinking is an incredibly powerful tool, and as you've seen, there are a lot of different approaches you can take depending on what works best for you. But the key is making it a habit, because that alone will put you ahead of so many others who pay lip service to strategic thinking, but never actually do it. Let's get something out of the way. You have time for strategic thinking. Many people say they don't. That's their primary reason or excuse for not doing it. But the truth is, it doesn't take hours and hours to think strategically. You don't have to go off to a silent retreat for a month. What it takes is cultivating the right mindset and being resolute and actually carving out small amounts of time to do it regularly. Here are 4 ways you can successfully make time for strategic thinking. First, it's important to protect your calendar. If you leave your calendar and how you spend your time up to other people, there's never going to be a magic opportunity for strategic thinking that presents itself. You have to carve it out and fight for it. So, well in advance, even a month or 2 out, designate time in your calendar for strategic thinking. It's essential to take a step back, even if it's for 1 hour a month, to give yourself time to ask, am I working on the right things? Do they line up with my actual goals? What can I be doing differently or better? Second, a great time to use for strategic thinking doesn't involve special carved out time at all. It's when you're occupied doing something else. Dutch researcher Op Dijksterhuis has shown that some of our most innovative and creative thinking comes when we're occupied with automatic physical tasks like driving or showering or jogging, because you're just the right amount of distracted to tap into new ways of thinking. So sometimes, instead of listening to the radio or an audiobook, think about using those times to muse about a problem you've been trying to solve. Third, you can train your muscles for strategic thinking by engaging in a daily writing practice, perhaps journaling for 5 or 10 minutes in the morning when you first wake up. This isn't strategy work per se. The goal is simply to write down what's on your mind. But it'll help you get in touch faster with concerns you have and help you actually capture ideas that might come to you, which so often, if you don't write them down, tend to flit away. You assume you'll remember them, but often you don't. Writing down your thoughts helps you go deep faster when it's time to focus on strategic thinking, and sometimes helps you process things and come up with new ideas in the background while you're doing other things throughout the course of the day. Finally, you can actually leverage what might otherwise be wasted time to think strategically. Maybe you're in a cab on the way to the airport, or you're waiting in line, or you're feeling overtired. You're definitely not in a state where you can do deep, meticulous work, but you can use that time to let your mind wander and see what ideas you come up with. One time, I was on the first day of a trip and badly jet-lagged. I sat down at a cafe for lunch and immediately started writing down ideas for my business because I was exactly the right amount of awake, but also tired and distracted to make big-picture connections. It would not have been a great time to do my taxes, but it was a great time to look at where I was going professionally. We all have time for strategic thinking. It's choosing to carve it out and deploy it effectively. And by using these 4 strategies, you can do it too. Lots of people focus on time when it comes to strategic thinking, as in they don't have enough of it. But here's a secret weapon for you. Try thinking about place. Because we all get into ruts in how we do things, whether it's getting coffee from the same place or taking the same route home from work every day, sometimes what's needed to break ourselves out of those ruts is changing our environment. The same is true for habits of thinking. We can push our boundaries and learn to think in new, innovative ways if we leverage the power of place. Here's how to do that. First, a big way to shake things up is to dramatically change your location. This won't be possible for everyone, but if you have a vacation coming up, instead of heading to your favorite destination again, why not try someplace you've never been before, especially if it's a foreign country and a place where you don't speak the language. That forces you to adapt and learn quickly and discover new ways of doing things. Even if you can't travel abroad, you can stretch your thinking by watching travelogues or foreign films and seeing what life is like in other places. Second, you can work from somewhere else in smaller, more local ways. For instance, if you're able to work from remote, you can try doing some work from a cafe, which can shake you out of habits of thinking. For instance, you might discover the ambient noise levels in the cafe make it easier for you to concentrate on writing projects. Even changing where you do work at your office can help you shift your perspective and help you see things differently. For instance, you could camp out in a conference room or a lounge area if your company has one. Finally, one of the most effective ways you can reset your thinking is by going outside. Fresh air and sunlight can help brighten your mood if you've been holed up inside all day, and it's even better if you're able to get out into nature with trees or water nearby. Studies have shown that being in nature decreases stress, and according to research by Professor David Strayer of the University of Utah, among others, it actually seems to bolster our creative thinking. That's incredibly helpful because when you're trying to think strategically, you want as many smart, innovative, creative ideas at your disposal as possible. So if you're trying to make strategic thinking a habit, consider ways to shift your location because that can make a big impact. A while back, I had an offer from a friend that was practically too good to pass up. Her organization wanted me to give a talk for a retreat they were doing, and I'd get a free trip to the Caribbean. How could you say no? But I did. And it was the right choice, because I created a series of 4 key questions that I share in my book, The Long Game, to help think through opportunities and whether they're worth pursuing. I hope they might be helpful to you too. First, ask yourself, what's the total commitment? It's really hard to make a good decision about whether you should pursue something or not until you've quantified how much effort it's going to take. Is this a 5-minute favor you're doing for someone or a 50-minute favor? Will preparing the presentation take you 2 hours, leaving you plenty of time to accompany your friend to the networking event later that day, or 6 hours? Scoping out projects properly by asking a lot of clarifying questions and, crucially, tracking the time you spend so you can double-check afterward how accurate your assumptions were is key to making better choices in the future. The second question is, what's the physical or emotional cost? This is what sunk the Caribbean speech opportunity. It sounded really fun, and I would have loved to hang out in a beautiful place with my friend. But I looked at the calendar, and while I could have managed it, I was traveling the week before and the week after. I would have been miserable with all that travel and no downtime to recover, so it wouldn't actually have been as fun as I imagined. If you're in an especially busy period at work or in your life, you need a higher bar before saying yes to a new commitment. Third, what's the opportunity cost? Choosing to do something means, of course, that you're not doing something else. But we sometimes forget that. Getting a part-time master's degree is great, but it probably means you'll have less time to volunteer for your local civic group. And spending more of the marketing budget on social media means there'll be less of it for radio ads. That's okay, and it may be the exact right choice, but we need to be conscious about the fact that we are choosing. Finally, how will I feel about this in a year? We all know time can provide a useful perspective. Something that seems huge today, like skipping a particular meeting, may literally be forgotten in a year. And sometimes it's the opposite. Missing an important event or failing to launch an initiative you'd been considering might become a source of real regret the more time passes. But we don't have to wait to get a sense of how we'll feel. If we ask the question now and project ourselves into the future, how will this feel a year from now? You're able to get a much better perspective through thoughtfully, deliberately imagining your future self. We can't know everything, but we have enough life history and experience to make pretty good guesses when we put our minds to it about which things will matter in the future and which will recede into the past. And that can help us make better decisions today. By asking these 4 questions I've developed, you can cut through a lot of the noise and make better decisions about whether a particular course of action is right for you. A surprising way we can also train ourselves to think differently and forcibly pull ourselves out of the day-to-day and into the realm of more strategic thinking is to change how we record our thoughts. Here are 3 possibilities to consider. The first, which I've started doing a lot more of, is actually making audio recordings of my conversations. Of course, you need to ask people's permission before you do that. But especially since more and more meetings are being held virtually now, it's not a bad idea to record them. That enables you to capture high-quality thoughts and ideas that may emerge in the moment, which otherwise might be lost. Just recently, I was on a video call with colleagues and one of them mentioned a story. I told her, that would make a great article. You should write that. And she wanted to do it. The next day, she sent over a draft description of the article, and it didn't sound right. I couldn't remember exactly what I had suggested she write about, but I knew that wasn't it. So she consulted the recording, because we'd made one, and she was able to isolate out that particular part of the conversation where we talked about the story and the potential angle of the article. And because of that, she was able to focus in on the right one. Second, if, like most people these days, you're used to writing on a computer, one way to force yourself to think differently is to actually take out pen and paper and try to handwrite things. This often opens up different ways of perceiving things. So if you're wanting to think big picture, try spending 10 or 20 minutes writing by hand and see what you come up with. Finally, you can often tap into completely different ideas and new ways of seeing things by drawing, which engages a different part of the brain. Sketch out your ideas and see how they fit together. What's the right visual metaphor for your goals and future plans? Is it a Venn diagram? Or maybe it's a pyramid where one activity is a foundation and everything builds on it. Maybe it's a series of arrows where one thing leads to something else, which leads to something else. Sometimes tapping into visual metaphors can help you think strategically because it becomes very obvious which thing comes first and which things come after that, so you know where to focus and what's most important. Half the battle in cultivating strategic thinking is shaking up the habits and the mental ruts we currently have. By following these tactics, that's exactly what you're going to do. Almost every professional has a to-do list of some kind. It could be on an app or it could be on an old-fashioned notepad. But either way, the effect is the same. We typically have a miscellaneous, undifferentiated list of projects that we need to tackle. They're usually not separated by priority, and pick up milk can be next to prepare for speech to the board. So often, we spend all our time, and by extension our lives, crossing things off that list. It feels satisfying in the moment, but accomplishing a never-ending list of priorities, some of which actually aren't even that important, isn't the recipe for becoming a strategic thinker. Instead, here are 2 frameworks you can use to elevate your thinking beyond day-to-day errands, and instead make sure you're doing the right things that'll advance your long-term goals and priorities. First, my colleague Marissa Fayer suggests creating a to-focus list instead of a to-do list. Of course, yes, you have a list somewhere of errands you need to do, but don't let it dictate your life. Instead, your to-focus list helps you see the bigger picture of where you want your life to go. You can create a 90-day list, a 1-year list, and a 3 to 5 year list. Maybe in 90 days, you want to have successfully onboarded your new employee and they're operating smoothly without your help. Maybe in a year, you'd like to have been promoted, so you can think about how to position yourself for that. And maybe in 3 to 5 years, you'll be managing a large team, so it's a good reminder to start laying the groundwork now to up the game on your leadership skills. Having a to-focus list and looking at it regularly enables you to weigh every activity you're spending time on and ask yourself, is this the best use of my time vis-a-vis long-term goals? There will always be random things you have to do that aren't specifically tied to your goals, like responding to emails. But overall, you want to minimize the time you spend on those and think about how you can maximize the activities that'll help contribute to your long-term vision. Second, my colleague Angela Myers has a great suggestion, which is developing a to-be list. This is an invitation to really think about who you want to be in the world and how you want to show up. Maybe it's as a loving partner or parent, so it's a reminder to allocate time in your day to be present for your family. Maybe it's as a visionary leader, so you want to spend time reading about new developments in your field so you can bring that to your company, or attending industry conferences so you can stay on top of innovations. Maybe it's as a helpful colleague, so you know that if you see a coworker struggling with a project, you want to make time to pitch in and help or show them some tips to make the process smoother. Aligning your values and your identity with how you spend your day-to-day life can be very helpful in sorting out what you actually should be doing. Most professionals have a to-do list, but if we can instead think about our to-focus list and our to-be list, we'll end up far more strategic and far more successful. Many of us make decisions and then never go back and revisit the process we used. But not analyzing our decisions is a missed opportunity. There are tools we can use to review past decisions so we can get sharper and better in the future. And also, it turns out, ways to test scenarios up front before committing to them and going all in. Here are 3 techniques you can use to turn making better decisions into a habit. First, if you have a decision to make, it's useful to note up front what your assumptions are. For instance, if you think it's a great idea to launch a new product, what are your assumptions behind that? Maybe you're assuming that it can be developed in 6 months, brought to market in another 6, and within its first year it'll sell 50,000 units. Those might be reasonable assumptions, but write them down so you can double check. For instance, in one of Amazon founder Jeff Bezos' annual letters to his shareholders, he talked about a friend of his who was incredibly frustrated because she couldn't learn a handstand in yoga. It turns out she had been assuming that she could pull it off with about 2 weeks practice. But if she had bothered to ask a yogi, they would have told her it actually takes most students about 6 months to learn to do them properly. By making our assumptions clear, we can check if they make sense, and also go back and reevaluate if it turns out things aren't developing the way we had planned. Second, before you settle on a specific option or course of action, even if you know it's the best one, go through the steps of creating at least 3 different possibilities. This is known as scenario thinking, and it's useful for surfacing ideas you might overlook, or possibilities that might seem extreme or improbable, but in the end may be useful to have considered. For instance, you might have option A, where everything goes completely according to plan with your new product. But option B has the product development timeline delayed by 3 months, maybe because there's a crucial part that's out of stock and you just can't access it. What would you do? How would that impact everything else downstream? And in option C, and frankly, this is how life is sometimes, not only is the part delayed by 3 months, but also 2 key R&D team members quit. So the development process is delayed by a year. If that happened, how do you deal with it? Can you outsource some elements? Do you have a list of potential backup hires ready to go? Can you actually think about creating a simpler product? These are questions it's useful to ask and think about up front, even if you never need to act on them. Third and finally, an increasingly popular practice in the business world is to conduct both a pre-mortem and a post-mortem analysis of any given project. Post-mortems are better known, and that's when you analyze something after the fact to determine what went wrong or right. That's of course valuable, and you'll want to bring all the players into the room so everyone's voice is heard, and you can surface issues that may have been hidden. But another important technique that gets less press is the pre-mortem, in which, before you launch a project, you gather together and ask, if this project were going to fail, what would the likely cause or causes be? By identifying areas of weakness, you can take action now, not wait until after the fact to shore them up. Most people never stop to analyze their decisions, at least not in depth. So if you do, and you utilize these 3 strategies, you are far ahead of the game in building strategic thinking habits. When it comes to strategic thinking, we can't rest on our laurels. We have to keep improving. Here are 2 strategies you can adopt to do that. First, create an inspiration file for yourself. There are probably certain areas where you know you want to become more strategic. Maybe it's following trends in your industry or broader geopolitics, or maybe it's in the mechanics of leadership, like how to get better at delegating. Every time you find an interesting article or podcast or chart or resource, make sure to save it in the inspiration folder, and you can place it in a subfolder depending on what the topic is, like artificial intelligence trends. You can review it in the moment and then save it for the future for your own use, as well as to share with colleagues who might be interested. Second, don't stop there with passive information acquisition. Instead, think about the skills and knowledge you proactively want to make an effort to learn, and then give yourself a strategy research project. For instance, Joe Sprangle, the former dean of Mary Baldwin University's School of Business, periodically gives himself assignments, just like you would if you were in a class and someone else were the professor, where he focuses on learning how to improve his skills in a certain area. For instance, most of us spend a lot of time answering email. If you could save even 10 minutes a day by becoming more efficient, that is a solid hour every week, which makes a big difference over time. So he might give himself a research project about handling email better, where he'd look up and read how-to articles and glean best practices. By spending even a few hours on that, he's freeing up dozens of hours for himself over the course of a year and getting an exponential return on his time and effort. If you're constantly on the lookout for ways to improve your strategic thinking over time, you're also going to get exponentially better. You remember the party game telephone. You whisper something to the person next to you, and then they repeat it to the person next to them, and on around the room, until the final person shares what the message is. And of course, it is nothing like what you originally said. Messages get distorted over time the further they are from the source. It's like that in business, too. You might solve this problem and that problem, but if it turns out those are actually symptoms and not causes, you're still going to be in for a world of trouble. A crucial part of strategy is you have to learn consistently to identify what the root cause really is and solve for that. Here are 3 ways to do it. First, don't necessarily accept others' interpretations as fact. It's possible the person telling you something could be exactly right, but it's also possible that they're overlaying their own biases and previous experiences onto a situation, and it's clouding their judgment, which means if you simply take their word for it, that it will be clouding yours. Instead, always make a point of looking for hard evidence. Ask why they believe something or what's informed their opinion. This isn't about acting suspicious, but it is about making sure they have hard evidence and aren't making assumptions or jumping to a solution prematurely. For instance, a consultant might be told by a client, "We need you to do a workshop." That's great. But the real question the consultant should be asking is, why? Because a workshop may be exactly the right thing to do, but it might not be. Maybe individual executive coaching would be more effective, or a team retreat, or something else, but we'll never know unless we ask why someone has come to a particular conclusion. Second, have clear goals. Too often in business, we assume everyone is on the same page, and that's not always true. Always make it explicit and talk about this with your colleagues, who and what you're optimizing for. Who is the audience you're serving? What do you want them to know or do? One person might think the advertising campaign is all wrong, but if he thinks you're advertising to parents and everyone else thinks you're supposed to be advertising directly to their kids, of course there's going to be a disconnect. Make it clear. Finally, anytime you're attempting to fix a problem or solve an issue, make sure you're addressing the root cause by leveraging the 5 whys process made famous by Toyota. Specifically, just like a 5-year-old, you want to ask why 5 times to ensure you're getting to the primary issue. You might start out trying to solve a budget problem because workers need so much overtime pay. But if you ask why, you'll discover they need overtime pay because they spend so much extra time fixing mistakes in the factory process. So you ask why, and you discover there's a problem with a certain machine. And you ask why, and you discover that you substituted a cheaper part last fall that isn't functioning as well. And now, what looked like a budget problem actually is a supply chain and sourcing issue. You want to get to the source so you can solve all the other problems downstream. So many people and companies fail at strategic thinking because they're always playing defense, scrambling to keep up with situations and put out fires. But if instead you put in just a little bit more time to question what's in front of you and see if there might be an upstream problem you can solve, you can make a dramatic impact. We'd all love for things in life to be easier. But ironically, without meaning to, we sometimes complicate things unnecessarily. So it can be powerful and liberating to periodically do an audit and question whether we're making things harder than they need to be. Here are 3 steps you can take to identify how you can simplify and streamline your processes. First, it's important to list and write down every single thing you do in a given process. It might sound onerous or unnecessary, but you don't want to skip this, because the trouble comes from assuming that something is necessary. When we list everything out carefully, we can often see what was invisible to us before. For instance, let's say you're presenting to a client, so the steps might involve having a team meeting to caucus about what you'll say, writing up the minutes and sending them out for approval, having another team meeting to determine who's going to present on which element, talking with your boss about graphics for the deck, looking for images to use, creating the deck, and getting feedback, revising the deck, and so on. Write it all down. Second, you're going to put a check mark next to every step in the process that's absolutely essential, and that helps you realize which ones aren't. Be ruthless here. Lots of things may feel essential, but you have to think literally. For instance, if you're presenting to a client, it really is essential to decide what you're going to say to the client and decide who's going to say it. But all the steps around creating the deck, for instance, actually aren't mandatory. They may be customary at your company, but that's different. If you wanted to, you could actually just present verbally or give them a one-pager with no graphics. Finally then, if you want to simplify things, it's time to test things out. It's a good idea to caucus about this in advance with your boss for anything major, of course. And obviously you'll want to run your tests in low-stakes situations at first, say a team meeting and not a big client presentation. But, for instance, try giving a presentation without a deck and see what happens. If everyone complains, fine. Maybe it is essential. But if no one notices or you actually get compliments for doing something different, maybe you can omit that step and save yourself hours of time. Too often we assume that things that are customary are actually mandatory, and that's rarely the case. By being thoughtful and interrogating the process just a little, we can be a lot more strategic about how and where we're spending our time. Here's a major problem with most people's strategy. They keep adding on more and more layers until it becomes unwieldy and untenable. There's only so much you can focus on. We have to prioritize, and that means being willing to make the tough decision to cut certain things out. But what? Here are 3 things to keep in mind to enable you to make hard but important choices. First, ask yourself 2 questions. Number 1, what is most critical? And number 2, what is most time sensitive? Fans of the so-called Eisenhower matrix, popularized by President Eisenhower and later Stephen Covey, will recognize that what we're talking about here is what's urgent and what's important. Obviously, you really only want to focus on things that are important. And if it's not, that's a pretty good candidate to cut out. And if something is also truly urgent, then it moves to the front of the line. The key here is making sure that even if you're doing urgent things now, that you plan to do important and non-urgent activities later and truly protect that time. For instance, you might need to focus on onboarding a new employee right now because they need your help and have to get oriented right away. But having that employee in place will free up your time in 2 months. And if you plan effectively, that lets you tackle a non-urgent but very important long-term innovation project. Next, to that point, think about delegation. What can only be done by you and what, with a little training, is something you could hand over to someone else. For instance, it might feel impossible to give a task to a colleague or an employee because there are so many minute steps. But if you invest the time now to write them all down and create a manual, that's more onerous in the moment, but it'll save you huge amounts of time moving forward. Take the steps now to systematize anything that you personally don't have to handle. A doctor makes the diagnosis, but she can outsource the billing, and you can follow the same principle in your own work. Finally, think about areas where you might be able to make cuts and actually improve performance or results in the process. Because it's not just employees that are burdened by complexity, it's also customers. Famously, Columbia psychologist Sheena Iyengar did an experiment with samples of jam at a grocery store. Customers liked it when there were lots of samples, but they bought very few. Meanwhile, when there were fewer samples, they were, paradoxically, more likely to make a purchase. In the end, the customers had been overwhelmed by the choices. For many companies, your product lines may have gotten unwieldy over time. It started with mild, medium, and spicy, and now there's mild, medium, and spicy with black beans and verde and ghost pepper and on and on. You may be able to increase sales and make things simpler not just for yourself, but for your customers and clients by cutting back your offerings. The art of strategy, many believe, is in deciding what not to do. So a crucial first step is being willing to cut things out and pare things down. By following these steps, you can do just that. One of the places where strategy and strategic thinking can be most helpful is in identifying important trends that we need to be aware of. But we also have to beware because there are a lot of false alarms out there. It might not actually be a trend, but a fad. Or maybe it's a trend, but people are insisting this will change everything overnight. And of course, most changes actually take a while to come to fruition. We have to be smart about evaluating information and judging for ourselves how we should respond. Here are 3 points to keep in mind as you cultivate your strategic thinking habits. First, it's clearly important for you to be aware of what the landscape is around you. Every smart professional understands this isn't your boss's job and it's not your company's job. It is your job to seek out knowledge and information. So keep up to date on trends in your industry and the world around you. Talk to your boss and get a sense of what they think is important. Read your company's annual report and see what the CEO talks about prioritizing. Maybe it's AI or 3D printing or something else entirely. Read a daily newspaper and subscribe to industry journals and newsletters. The more diverse your information sources, the better prepared you are for whatever comes your way. Second, get clear on foundational principles in your industry, but also in business in general. There are some things that almost certainly will never change, and if we keep them in mind, we can make smart decisions. For instance, as long as everything else is equal, customers will always prefer a lower price. As another example, people will always need food. The form and the type might change, but as long as we're alive, people will need to eat in some fashion. Think about aspects of your business that will never go out of style. And third and finally, Now it's time to understand what might change. Customer preferences certainly do. Just look at hairstyles from the 60s and compare them to the 80s and then today. Technology certainly changes. Pretty much no one faxes anymore. And distribution channels might change, or the competitive landscape, because maybe two of your competitors merge. But if you can simultaneously keep in mind what isn't changing and what might change, you can begin to identify how you and your company can adapt successfully. By developing these habits of strategic thinking, you can focus on unchanging principles and still adapt to changing circumstances. It can feel impossible sometimes to get everything done that we need to, especially important strategic priorities. We feel like we're constantly putting out fires and there's never enough time. That's why we need to consciously make an effort to create leverage in our lives. How can we get more value out of the time and energy and effort we're already putting in? Here are two ways to do it. First, a great question to ask yourself is, where else can you deploy an existing asset? In other words, if you've already done something once, how can you get it in front of new people or spread the word in other places so the value is maximized? For instance, if you've written a blog post, maybe you can also pull out a great quote or your top 3 takeaways from that post and share it on social media. Take one asset and use it 3 times or 10 times in different ways. Similarly, you may have a product that's been popular with one niche. So now ask yourself, where else could we market this? What other niches might respond? Do something once and find small ways to tweak it so you can keep leveraging its value. Second, ask yourself, how can you do 2 things at the same time? That might sound like a bad question because we've all heard how unproductive multitasking is. And by and large, that's true. If you're listening to a webinar and are trying to write a report simultaneously, you're going to do a bad job at both. But that's because you're trying to use the same part of your brain for those 2 things. Instead, look for complementary things you can do at the same time, where one doesn't compete with the other. For instance, you could call your parents to check in while you're taking a walk, or listen to an audiobook for professional development while you're driving to work or cooking dinner. That enables you to use the time twice as efficiently. We can't make more time, but we can get smart about how we use it, and leverage is the answer. By following these tips, you can make better and more strategic use of your time than almost anyone else around you. Strategic thinking is something everyone knows they should do, but very few actually do. Part of the problem is they see it as a special thing where you need just the right conditions, a cabin in the woods or a sabbatical in order to do it. That rarely happens, and so they don't. And that's a shame, because how tragic to spend so much time and effort and hard work on something only to realize you were working on the wrong things all along. You can't let that happen to you, and you won't. Because in going through this course, you've learned the key principles behind how to make strategic thinking a habit. Not a nice to have and not something you do once a year, but something that in small ways you do every day. It becomes part of who you are and how you see the world. And it's not like you have to do everything we talked about, though that would be great. Even choosing one tactic to focus on or starting to ask yourself just a few of the key questions we've raised can make an enormous difference in your ability to focus your time and energy strategically and get powerful results. To continue learning more about strategic thinking, you can check out my other foundational LinkedIn course, which is just titled Strategic Thinking. You can also follow me on LinkedIn or check out other strategic thinking resources on my website at doryclark.com. Take care and good luck.